Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel and happy new year, happy 2024. The new year is upon us and that can mean but one thing. Your feeds, if you watch a lot of booktube and probably BookTok and Bookstagram, are about to be flooded with everybody's favourite books of the year, including mine. I am no different. I am here to share with you the books I read in 2023 that I adored above all else for one reason or another. Now, I probably don't need to explain to you what this video is all about, but for those of you who might be new, I'm not necessarily going to be sharing books that came out in 2023, simply my favourite books I read in 2023. Now, there are 15 books on this list, however, 4 of them are like part of series, so there's like 2 sets of sequels, if that makes sense. So there's kind of like 13 books on this list and then 2 series. But really anything else I start to say will literally just be an unnecessary ramble at this point. So let's just get straight into the books, shall we? Because there's a few to talk about and I definitely think I could talk about them for a while. I decided to split this year's books into genres just to give you a better idea of what to expect. You know, if you really want some non-fiction, then the first 3 books are going to be for you. But other than that, there's no particular order. There's no like top book and bottom book. They're all wonderful. So yeah, let's start with non-fiction, shall we? And the first 2 non-fiction books in this favourites video are like tangentially related, and you might be able to glean some of the subjects I've been finding really interesting recently via them. The first one is The Once and Future Sex by Eleanor Janega, which has the subtitle, I'm reading it off my computer here, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society. So this one does have a pretty self-explanatory title, even though I misunderstood the title when I bought the book. I thought this book was about sex in medieval times, because clearly I didn't read the subtitle. But if you read that subtitle, it is evident what it's about. Regardless of what I thought I was getting when I bought this book, I am glad I bought it because it was a really interesting, accessible, well-researched history book about women's roles in medieval society. It's not a really long book, so obviously it's a bit of an overview. It's like a starter. If you're not really familiar, I think, with women's history, women in medieval society, even just like medieval society in general, I actually think this would be a really good like intro to those subjects via one path. Now, I'm not a complete noob when it comes to medieval history, but my speciality is also ancient history, so I do find when I read books like this, I learn a lot of new things, and I learned a lot from this book that I found really fascinating. There are also some parallels that the author drew with the ancient world, although as an ancient historian, there was one thing I didn't necessarily agree with on her interpretation of antiquity, but it was so minor and irrelevant kind of to the overall concept of the book that it doesn't matter. This is just me being nitpicky. I loved the content when it came to the medieval world. Like I said, I found it very accessible, despite not being a medieval historian. I thought it was written in a really accessible way. I think it drew parallels to other periods in history, which might help contextualise what's going on. I think that's important when you're looking at history. And it also drew parallels with the modern world, especially in the conclusion, which again I think is really important because it's showing the relevancy of this topic and how maybe certain attitudes towards women in medieval society continue to impinge on or affect women in modern society. So I really enjoyed that. And yeah, other than that, I feel like I would just start listing off interesting facts from this book, but you should read it if you want those facts. I thought it was accessible. I thought it was the perfect balance of accessible while still being like academic and well researched, if that makes sense. Like, I have read history books in the past which clearly have had limited research applied to them, and even if I'm not an expert in that area, I can spot the mistakes, so that's probably not a good sign, whereas this felt very well sourced, very well referenced, very well argued, if that makes sense. And I just found it really interesting. I'm really enjoying learning more about medieval history. I plan on reading more in the new year. If you've got any recommendations, let me know, but for now this one was excellent, would highly recommend it. Now, the next book is not a medieval history book per se, but it is a book studying medieval literature, and that is King Arthur's Enchantresses by Caroline Larrington. So this is a literary study. Now, this one definitely leans a little bit more to the academic side of things, and it's one that you will benefit from being at least semi-familiar with the Arthurian romances of medieval literature, but you certainly don't need to have read all of them, even most of them, to still, I think, follow along with this book and find it really interesting. If anything, if you've already got an interest in Arthurian legend, characters like Morgan, Lady of the Lake, the Queen of Orkney, Guinevere even, etc., that then you might find your like appetite whetted by this book to learn more. But I think occasionally I would find myself seeking out the reference that the author had made, so I'd like go and like get out Thomas Malory and be like, right, okay, what were we referencing here, just to like help myself better understand it. So it was one that I think I referenced a bit more in reading, if that makes sense. So in that sense it was a little bit more academic and it did get very analytical, but I thought it was fascinating. I really enjoyed that it took a focus on the women of Arthurian legend, and some of the tropes, we could say, of the women of Arthurian romances. You know, you've got your good enchantresses, your bad enchantresses, how actually, like, originally in some of these storylines they're a lot less defined, and then depending on the society that's writing about them, because this is going over hundreds of years, they become more defined, more tropey, perhaps more sexist, and that's really interesting. And it's interesting to see their development, their different roles within the text, and just to see a book that focuses on the women and their stories in Arthurian legends. You will learn some Arthurian legends through this book, but it's also not a book that is designed to teach you Arthurian legends. It's a book that analyses Arthurian legends. So like I said, it's good to have, I think, some sort of basis going into this, but if you do find Arthurian romance as a genre of medieval literature interesting, and the origin of the folklore that informed that, then I think this is a really interesting book. Then lastly, for non-fiction, we have a much smaller book, a tiny little book in fact, and it is of course one of the 404 Inkling series. Will I ever shut up about this series? Probably not. It's one of my favourites. I think it's a really, really fun, accessible way to learn about new non-fiction topics, and to hear somebody basically like super overanalyze something really niche, which I love. And the one that I read this year that I think really stood out to me was the Loki Variations by Carl Johnson, and subtitled The Man, the Myth, the Mischief. So again, I have a like familiarity with Norse legend, but I still think there's plenty for me to learn and to discover. And what I really loved about this book was the way it tackled the concept of Loki, because like with a lot of mythological figures, Loki is kind of more than the ancient and medieval Norse texts. Loki has become a figure in the modern world through all of his different variations, and her variations and their variations, because Loki takes on different genders. And it was really interesting seeing all of those things studied in tandem, because if we're not just looking at ancient traditions, like ancient mythologies, in terms of what they meant to the ancient people who maybe wrote down our earliest examples of them, like saying this is what the ancient Greeks thought about this ancient Greek myth, myth means different things throughout the sort of generations, throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia even, and it grows and it changes, and it's interesting to see how things can veer quite far from the originals, how they can be reinterpreted by new audiences, and I really, really enjoy that, because myth has such a like grand life, and it's interesting to see a little book that basically just took a really like in-depth look at one figure of mythology, one that the author has their own relationship to, having grown up in the Scottish Islands, which have their own links to Norse traditions, and I just found it really, really interesting. Again, I thought it was very accessible. It was sort of like a mythological historical study as well as being like a pop culture study, and those are all things I love. So it was just great. I found it really interesting. I learned some new things about Loki, and I also enjoyed the author's approach. So I'm continuing to love this series overall. So next up, I thought I would focus on romance, for which I have 4 books. But kind of 2, because it's 2 series in which I have read 2 books and loved both books equally, so I just want to like talk about the 2 books in each series and the series as a whole in general. There's a cat outside. Oh, hello. One sec, I have to see the cat. Sorry, that was really important that I said hello to the cat that was at the window. But now that I've petted the cat, let's go around to talking about the romance books. So let's start off with the two books in the Ravenswood series by Talia Hibbert, who you may know from her novel Get a Life, Chloe Brown, which has been very, very popular. Well, Talia Hibbert actually has a big back catalogue of romances, which I'm starting to dip my toes into, and she has quickly become one of my favourite romance authors, if not authors. I love her work, I love her characters, her character dynamics and the relationship she creates between them. And the Ravenswood series is actually a series that I have physically, so I can just show you the copies here. But I don't have book 1 because I read book 2 and 3. If you don't read romance, you might not know that most of the time romance, although being part of a series that's perhaps chronological, doesn't necessarily need to be read in order because each book follows a different couple. So I started with book 2, Untouchable, when I came across it in a queer bookshop in Manchester because the female protagonist is bisexual, and decided to pick it up, assuming I could read it without having read the previous one, and I couldn't, it was fine. And then I loved this book so much, I read it in like 2 days on my train back from Manchester, stayed up late reading it and then finished it the next day, that I immediately ordered book 2, which is that kind of guy. So let's start with Untouchable. Like I said, this is book 2 and I still haven't read book 1, but I'm going to buy it and read it. And in this book we follow the sister of the main character in book 1, so that's like the context. But in this book we're following Hannah and Nate. Now Hannah is an expert in childcare, but because she got arrested not that long ago, she can no longer work in that field, so she's kind of between jobs, kind of miserable, and struggling with pre-existing depression. And then we have Nate, who Hannah went to high school with and has been away for many, many, many years, but has come back to Ravenswood because his mum has been diagnosed with cancer and needs care, and he is a single dad with 2 little kids. So they end up reconnecting when he hires Hannah as a private nanny, which could end up becoming a really sort of problematic situation for a romance, obviously, because he's in a position of power as her boss. But I feel like that is an aspect that the book handles really well, and doesn't take lightly. So I really, really appreciate that, because I do not like uneven power dynamics in romance novels that aren't explored and just like sort of glossed over. So I really, really appreciated that. I really appreciated the depth of both of these characters. It's quite a domestic romance. It's set in this small town near Manchester, where the 2 characters obviously, like, they have their own family stories, they have their own experiences with romance in the past. Nate's a widow, they have perhaps their own struggles. Obviously Nate has the external struggle of trying to help his mother, while Hannah has been struggling with mental health, and they really open up a beautiful path to communication and support between one another, which I absolutely adore. I think that Talia Hibbert just genuinely writes such healthy relationships that we could all probably do with learning from, modelling our behaviour on, and I obviously appreciate the bisexual representation. Then I read book 2, which is about Nate's brother Zach and his love interest Ray, who's new to town after a messy divorce. She's going through, again, her own trauma of a really toxic marriage that ended with him having an affair, a kind of toxic relationship with her mother, and just kind of being like trodden on her whole life and her career as an author. And then we have Zach, who has recently sort of found the language to articulate to himself that he is demisexual, and he's processing all of his kind of past relationships and interactions with women now that he's admitted that to himself, and he's frustrated that it's something that people don't expect of him, and him and Ray become really close friends, which ends up in them formulating a sort of fake dating situation when Ray needs a date to a literature fantasy conference, and naturally they fall in love with one another. So again, it's really nice because again we've got some more LGBTQ plus representation on the ace spectrum in this case, and demisexual is something I don't read a lot of. I've not found a lot of romance books that include demisexual protagonists, so that was really wonderful, and I think it was really done well. It was really heartbreaking in moments to read about their past, but also really encouraging to see them learn to communicate their needs and their wants, and support one another, again a little bit like in Untouchable. I just think Talia Hibbert writes wonderful, wonderful relationships and character dynamics. So yeah, loved this series. Then I read 2 historical romance novels, which were actually books 1 and 2 in their series, and that is Wicked and the Wallflower and Brazen and the Beast by Sarah MacLean. So this wasn't my first time reading Sarah MacLean. I've read her in the past and really enjoyed her romance novels, but these books very much cemented her as a favourite romance author. I loved these books, and I think there was some aspects about them that made them a little bit different to a lot of other historical 19th century romance books I've read, including the fact that the protagonists are not all nobility. So if you read a lot of historical romance, you probably know that it is difficult to find romances where the characters are not all nobility, they're not all of the noble classes. Now that's not to say any of the characters in these books in particular are living in poverty, but some of them have gone through that precarious situation in life, and in both instances the male protagonists are men who work and run businesses in Covent Garden in London, and I really loved the atmosphere and the setting of these books. Now a lot of historical romances are set in London, that's not new, but I loved the rich detail of the Covent Garden scene in that time, because although Covent Garden is quite like affluent now, it certainly wasn't back then, and it really felt like Sarah MacLean had researched the period and really given her all into painting this detailed picture of this area and this place and the people there, and I loved that. I loved it. It helped me fully immerse myself in the world. And then we have 2 female protagonists who are more of the aristocratic background. One of them is not as aristocratic as the other, but you know what, they're like from very like privileged, comfortable positions, shall we say. So of course they end up entering into relationships with our Covent Garden, possibly criminals. And it's fantastic. I absolutely loved both of these books. I think Brazen and the Beast, book 2, might have eked it out for my favourite spot so far, but there's a third book where the roles are reversed, and the female protagonist is part of this Covent Garden crew, and the male protagonist is of the nobility, which I do plan on reading in 2024, so who knows, maybe that'll take the top spot. But for now, I love these books. I think Sarah MacLean writes beautifully. I think she has really luscious prose with gorgeous descriptions, gives you a real sense of place and setting and character, and I love them. So I just filmed myself talking about 3 separate books without realising that my camera wasn't filming. So all of this is about to be repetition for me. Hopefully I can retain some of the enthusiasm that I had the first time I talked about it all. But the next category is SFF, so it would be separate science fiction and fantasy, but I only have 1 science fiction book, so we're just gonna bung it all together. And that is starting with the fantasy. I actually just can't believe I've said all this already. It's fine. So the first fantasy book I want to talk to you about is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Emily Fawcett, which is the first in a series I think is going to be on a lot of people's favourite books list of the years. It only came out in the past like year to year and a half, I forget exactly, but it's not been out long and a lot of people were reading it in 2023, so I think I'm not going to be the only one who's got it on their list, and I think that's absolutely fair because it's a wonderful book and I want to add my voice to championing it. It's brilliant. It's one of those books where it has a lot of my favourite old reliable fantasy tropes while also feeling very fresh and new. It's also a book I would very much like categorise as like light academia, cosy fantasy, which is definitely one of my favourite fantasy subgenres, and in particular when it's got a historical setting as this does. However, the historical setting is sort of alternative history. It's very much got the sense of the late 1800s, early 1900s Britain and Europe, but it's a slightly different world from our own because there's an academic discipline within this world which studies the fair folk, and I don't just mean the folklore or fairy tales or mythology of the fair folk, but actually like the biology of the fair folk and the culture of the fair folk out in the field, because these are real creatures, not that they're not necessarily real in our world, but like they're verifiable creatures that are well documented, well acknowledged, have regular interactions with humanity, and which there is this discipline of study for. And our protagonist, Emily Wilde, is an academic in this field who is off on a research trip to a small Scandinavian-esque fictional island to study their local fae. Of course, her study plan, although meticulous, doesn't quite go according to plan when she ends up a little bit more entwined in this fairy culture than she expected. Throughout the story, she also has to face some surprising revelations about her colleagues and her relationships with said colleagues, as well as a possible romantic interest that she hadn't really considered before now. There is a undercurrent of romance in this book. It's not the like sole purpose of the book. It's not necessarily primarily a romance novel, but it has got that within it, and I really enjoyed that edition. I think it was played really nicely, and I love the dynamic and the playfulness between Emily and said love interest. They very much have grumpy sunshine dynamic, but in my favourite way, which is grumpy woman sunshine man. I love that trope. So I really love this book. Like I said, it's so cozy, it's so charming. Charming is like the top word I would use to describe it, and I think it's worth all the hype, so do check it out. But the next fantasy book I want to talk about is actually another book which is the first in a series, this time of a YA fantasy series, and that is This Poison Heart by Kalynn Bayron. So this is a contemporary fantasy novel which takes inspiration from Greek mythology. It alludes to and weaves in Greek mythology without being a retelling necessarily. Now, I am much more comfortable using retelling in a very loose sense to refer to any book that interplays with mythology, but if you're looking for something that's like hitting the point marks of one specific mythological narrative or specifically about one mythological character, then it's not that. The mythology is something of the past which is continuing to interact with the present in this situation. Our protagonist Briseis, who's not the Briseis of mythology, even though she has a mythological name, is an adoptee who's been raised by two mothers in New York who own a florist. They've got a lovely family dynamic. I love how positive their relationship is, and that is absolutely wonderful. Briseis is also a bisexual character, so there's lots of great LGBTQ plus representation in there, but what sets Briseis apart from her friends' family is that she has a magical ability to control or influence plant life, and this is something that she's dealt with for years, and her family knows about, but obviously she doesn't tell everybody about. So this isn't one of those stories actually where like a magical power is uncovered and that's what kicks things off. She's known about this power for years, which I think is a little bit different and nice to see. What kicks off the storyline really is the fact that Briseis is left a large house by a biological aunt she never met. So her biological mother, again, who she never met, sister, leaves her this house, and her family are struggling a little bit financially, so they decide to take this house up to go live in it. It's more of a rural setting than where they currently live, but they just think it might be a new opportunity, only to discover that maybe there's more secrets to be discovered about Briseis' biological family, including their relationship to plant life. Like I said, there are a lot of allusions to and interweaving of Greek mythology, potentially in the ancestry of this family, in terms of the plant magic. In particular, one of the primary myths it alludes to is the myth of Medea and Jason, but I won't say too much other than that because I think it's nice the way it's all done, and I think you'll enjoy discovering it all. It's not a book you need to be familiar with mythology to enjoy by any means, because it kind of explains the necessary parts, and Briseis herself isn't really familiar with Greek mythology, but I do think it's a nice addition, and I like the way the myth is handled throughout the book, so I thought this was fantastic. I also think it's where you start seeing, in terms of having read a few Kalynn Bayron books, her interest in the horror genre. Obviously Kalynn Bayron has since published horror books, but there is a little bit of those darker themes in this book, and I enjoyed that as well. If you're not into series though, I do have a standalone fantasy book for you, and that is Rose Daughter by Robin McKinley. So this is actually the second Beauty and the Beast retelling published and written by Robin McKinley. The first of which is Beauty, which I've also read and enjoyed, but Rose Daughter takes it to a whole new level. This book is phenomenal. It has like some of the aspects of Beauty and the Beast that you very much come to expect in the same way that Beauty does, but it also has a lot of unique elements, twists and turns that you might not see coming, and in particular what I feel sets it apart is depth, like depth of character and depth of world building. Like it takes what is a short fairy tale, basically a short romance fairy tale storyline that's obviously not that long, and creates a very rich world and a very rich set of characters, not just within Beauty but in the Beast and her father and her sisters, and I loved all of that. I found it such a like enveloping read. Like one of those books where you just like fall into it and you fall into the world, and the rich prose, because Robin McKinley can weave a sentence. This woman knows how to use the English language, and it's beautiful, and it creates a real sense of place, and I really, really loved that about it. I just found it like quite a soft, again, quite cozy, slow-paced, but detailed fantasy that was very, like, comforting and magical. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. I enjoyed Beauty, but this book was just something else. Now, I probably don't need to tell you much about the plot, because it's a Beauty and the Beast retelling, you know the main crux of it, but it has that sort of like historical fantasy-esque setting like the original. It feels like it's in a very fairy tale world with lots of magic, etc. But yeah, it will definitely throw you some surprises, which I really enjoy. And then we have the solo sci-fi book of this video, which is A Sam for the Wild Robot Built by Becky Chambers. So this is the first in a Monk and Robot book series by Becky Chambers, which is a novella series published by Tor. Again, what I would very much describe as like soft sci-fi, soft cozy sci-fi, hope punk sci-fi, and it's the second series by Becky Chambers that I've started. I love her novel The Long Way to a Small and Angry Planet, but this was just beautiful in its own right. Like, it was different, but it had, like, if you enjoy Becky Chambers' other books, you'll enjoy this because it has a lot of what is so charming about Becky Chambers' writing and world building, but it's also very much its own unique thing, and she did something really interesting here that I loved. So I think I already said this, I would definitely consider a cozy sci-fi book, and I would also consider it a really comforting read. Like, if you're in need of something short, light, but also kind of deep to read that might bring you a little comfort when you're feeling down or you need a distraction or to escape the world, and this is a really beautiful little book. And I would also go so far as to consider it a kind of philosophical work. I very much feel like it contemplates a lot of philosophical ideas, and it's very thoughtful, particularly in terms of the conversations between the main characters, who are our monk and our robot, which are all lovely. I'd actually love to do a video, I think, on like modern fiction as contemporary philosophy texts, which might be interesting. Let me know. That's like a bit off topic, but it's something I've been thinking about recently. So it's got that aspect to it, which is really, really nice. But in terms of the storyline, it's again quite soft. It's not like super like action-packed, tons happen. It's about our protagonist, who is a monk, and they are a tea monk, so their job is to provide a safe space for people to come, have a cup of tea, share their woes or their thoughts, have a rest, find a space of comfort, and that's what they do for them. But they're struggling to find their own comfort and purpose. They're feeling a little bit lost in terms of what they want from life, and so they decide to go on this little adventure pilgrimage to a location which nobody's been to in many years, which is out in the wilderness, because this world is very much split. It's in a far-flung future where the wilderness is kind of been left to be wild in order to save the planet, and it is occupied not only by animals and other parts of nature other than humans, but the wild built, or the robots of this world. So however long ago, decades and decades ago in this world, AI and robots and machinery gained consciousness, but it didn't turn into this like horrible overthrow the world apocalyptic revolution. It's very different from most sci-fi novels where something like this happens, where instead these conscious robots just want to live freely and explore the world, and humanity decides to let them, and we end up in this much more peaceful society where the two live apart from one another, and they haven't interacted in a long time until our monk meets a robot in the wilderness, and this robot wants to know about humans, so they start chatting and journeying together, and their conversations are really interesting. They have really distinct personalities, which I really enjoyed reading about, and I very much cannot wait to read more about them in book 2. So yeah, this was a very comforting, cozy but thoughtful read, which I'm looking forward to reading more of in 2024. I only just finished this one, so it was quite a recent read for me. Okay, so the last 4 books in this video are a bit of a mishmash. We've got 2 sort of traditional thrillers, one which is kind of like lit fic with a thriller element, and a collection of poetry, or a novel in verse. So let's just start and go through them all, shall we? The first one is Girl 11 by Amy Suter Clark. Now this is a thriller mystery novel with a podcaster protagonist. So if you're into your true crime podcasts, then you might really like this one. But also, if you're not into true crime podcasts like me, who doesn't really like the true crime podcast subgenre and finds a lot of them to be quite insensitive. Not all of them, I think some of them are done well. I just haven't gotten into them, but I do think there are some issues around the genre. You will also like this book because I very much think it kind of like takes what is interesting about true crime podcasts without being kind of indelicate and potentially offensive to real life victims, survivors and family members. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book, and it made me very excited for Amy Suter Clark's new book, which is coming out this year. And like I mentioned, it follows our protagonist, who is a podcast host. She used to work in social services, I think. She used to like work with children in dangerous situations, and in that sense she's got sort of like ties to the police and an experience of sort of investigating like mistreatment, etc. So she does have like a background in researching these kind of issues that she brings to her podcasting, and she tackles cold cases on her podcast, which is like an investigative true crime podcast which tackles crimes that have not been solved and potentially provides new evidence and new investigation to them. She has helped solve crimes in the past, and in her new series she is taking on the case of a serial killer who's been dormant for many years, but who was killing women in descending age order. So like, I can't remember exactly, but maybe starting at like 20 and then going down until Girl 11, when she escaped and he disappeared. He was never caught. Now, naturally, with any kind of novel, I think, that handles a cold case mystery, that case ends up coming up into the contemporary timeline, either through like a copycat or the original killer, or those that were connected to it, or the people who were the original victims. It sort of starts to rear its head again, doesn't it? Because that's what makes a contemporary thriller interesting. You need something going on in the contemporary setting as well, and that ends up dragging our podcaster into it and her investigation, especially when one of her potential witnesses is attacked. So I don't want to say much, because with thriller and mystery novels, the kind of like lack of knowledge is part of the fun, is part of the enjoyment, is part of the adventure, and I think this one's just done really well. I found it just really compelling. When I started it, I couldn't stop. I do this even though I listen to an audiobook, so I wasn't doing this at all. But I really enjoyed listening to it, and I really enjoyed the audiobook in particular because it lent into the podcasting element. There are chapters which are from the protagonist's podcast, and they are recorded slightly differently with different voice actors, and I thought that was really well done. So if you like audiobooks, this is a great one to check out in that format. But yeah, I really liked the writing, the pacing, the sort of like points that it hit in order to like keep you interested, and the twists and turns and the red herrings, etc. So if you're looking for a new thriller, I would highly recommend this one. But next up is a thriller mystery novel that was actually a gift from my friend Jen, because she absolutely adored this book, and rightly so. It is the first in a existing trilogy. I am hoping there's going to be more in this series, because there's definitely room for more books in this series, but at the moment it's 3 books, and that is The Silent House by Nell Pattison. And I loved this book so much that I immediately read books 2 and 3. Like, I think I read all 3 back to back, which is quite rare for me when reading a series. Usually there's a gap in between the books, but you can tell I love a series when that happens, like with the romance series I've already mentioned, and now this one. But The Silent House was definitely my favourite of the series. Like, it is a standout book that can work as a standalone if you don't want to invest in a series, but if you like the characters and you want to see what happens to them next, read on, but the mystery alone stands by itself. So our protagonist is a translator for the deaf community. She is hearing, but she was raised by deaf parents, and she's grown up with signing being her first language, and now she works in that industry. And she's recently gone freelance, which leads her to being called in as a translator by the police, who are investigating a crime that happened in the house of a deaf family, in which their youngest child was murdered during the night, but obviously nobody heard anything. And she is the translator in this situation, but obviously she gets dragged into the mystery. The deaf community where she lives isn't like that big, so she knows some of the people involved tangentially, and she ends up sort of curious about what might have happened and undertaking some of her own investigations, which end up drawing in like her sister and other friends that she has within the deaf community. And one of the things I really enjoyed about this book is not just obviously the really fascinating mystery, but it was the very rich painting it provided of this community in this part of England, and it added a lot of depth to the book, which was really, really well done. It's something that it's something that the writer also has first-hand experience from, that she's drawing from. It was really, really well done, really interesting, a really good mystery, and I loved our protagonist Paige. I thought, although she kind of took some missteps and maybe should have thought through some of her actions, we all do silly things. I still really, really enjoyed her as a character, and I became very invested in her life naturally, because then I kept reading. So yeah, really enjoyed this book, hoping there'll be a book 4 in the future, and would highly, highly recommend it. Then for the sort of like lit fic thriller overlap novel is one I think that again you're going to be seeing in a lot of people's favourite books of the year video, because it's a relatively new release that had a lot of hype, and that is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. Now this is actually a book which I recorded a reading vlog for, so if you want to like see my reactions as I read the book and my thoughts as I read the book, you should go watch that, because obviously they'll be much more in depth and there'll be much more of them. But to summarise here, this novel, if you're not familiar, is from the perspective of a very unreliable narrator, our protagonist, who is also the villain of the story. Our protagonist is a writer who's not had a like greatly successful career at this point. She's had one book and it's not like sold loads of copies, but do you know what, she's really not that bad off, but she's obviously very dissatisfied with her career and her life, and she has a lot of pent-up jealousy for one of her only friends, who's a much more successful author by like traditional terms, who's very well known, and it really feels like they shouldn't be hanging out because all she does is resent her, but still she continues to meet up with her, including on the day that she dies. So our protagonist's friend dies, and she finds her manuscript in her flat and decides to steal it and pass it off as her own. Now this isn't like a murder, she doesn't murder her friend or anything like that, but she very much takes advantage of her friend's death, and through publishing this book, which is a historical novel that looks at the experience of Chinese Americans during the 20th century, she basically ends up Asian catfishing. Like, she never explicitly tells anybody that she is Chinese, but she lets people assume. And not only that, but her publishers very much feed into that, and her editors and her publicists feed into this and encourage it, even though they don't know she's stolen the manuscript, so they're not party to this problematic side of things. They are still incredibly problematic too, and it's quite a satirical novel that, like I said, has a very unreliable narrator and is kind of highlighting and poking fun at a lot of the problematic elements and racism within the publishing industry. And it's one of those books where you read it and you think, oh, this just seems so absurd, but actually could believe it would happen. Like, could believe it. Could believe it. And certainly aspects and parts of the storyline have happened before. So it was really interesting from that perspective, and it's one that I just absolutely devoured. Then last but not least is not a recent release. This book came out quite a few decades ago, and I finally got around to reading it after everybody recommended it to me for many years, which is The Autobiography of Red by Anne Carson. So this is a novel in verse / collection of poetries. It's one of those It's one of those poetry collections where each poem feeds into an overall narrative. So we're following the life of the character Geryon through individual poems, which is why I would call it simultaneously a novel in verse and a collection of poems, because each poem also stands on its own. But I wouldn't read them out of order, if that makes sense. And while it is set in the 20th century, which was when it was written, it is actually a retelling of Greek mythology, following the character of Geryon, who is a gigantic monster in Greek mythology slain by the hero Heracles. However, in this instance, Geryon is a young man who is physically different, yes, because he has wings, but also internalizes this idea of himself as a monster because of his sexuality. And it's exploring his dynamic with Heracles, which is no longer one of like hero slays monster, but of a romantic relationship which is toxic and which harms Geryon through their relationship rather than like obviously through the kind of like mythological monster slaying narrative. And it is so beautifully done. It's in some places quite a forlorn, sad book. A lot of sad things happen in it, but it's also one of those ones which ends on a very hopeful note, a very uplifting note, which I really appreciated and I thought brought it all together really nicely. And I think it's one that is really beautifully written. And again, Anne Carson has a wily way with the English language that is just gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous to read individually in terms of the poems and as a whole. But I also think it's one that a lot of people will be able to relate to on some level or another and kind of like find a connection to Geryon through and experience some of their own ups and downs through this storyline and maybe feel a little bit of hope. It's definitely one you don't need to be familiar with Greek mythology to read, like in the slightest. It's very much its own narrative, but I thought it was really interesting how it was inspired by and how it drew on Greek mythology. So loved that book and glad I finally got around to reading it, because like I said, people have been telling me to read it for years. But yeah, that brings me to the end of it. Those are my favourite books of 2023. I hope you enjoyed hearing about them. I hope maybe you've heard about at least one book that you'd maybe like to read now. I hope my recommendations have gone forth into the world and perhaps will end up on your bookshelves, or if you already own one of these books, you finally get around to reading it like I did. I'd love to hear about your favourite books of the year, because you know I've got a lot of reading to do in 2024 and I might need some recommendations. So let me know your favourite book or your favourite books, what you loved about them, and also I'd love to talk more about these books if you've read them. So do leave your comments down below. But until next time, happy reading. I hope you find lots of new favourite books in 2024 and I will see you all again in the next one. Bye everybody!